All right, get to know the Bible. We're going to be talking today about the Intertestament period, which is a period between Malachi, the last Old Testament book, written about 430 BC, and the birth of Christ. So it's about 430 years of history that's not in the Bible, but it kind of set the stage for the birth of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, and then of course the ministry of the church. So a lot happens in those 400 years, and so the goal of this video is to give you some insight into what those things were, and the Judea or the Israelite area that was in 430 BC when Malachi wrote his book, and the Judea that Christ was born into are two completely different areas. A lot goes on, so that's what we're going to cover today. Just a little catch up, or this is our fifth or sixth video in the series. We're telling the story of the Bible. The Bible is one story, 66 books, and we're looking at people and places. We're looking at archaeology, geography, history, and prophecy. How these items make up the story of the Bible, so that when you understand the bigger picture, when you start to read individual scriptures or individual books, it'll fit the bigger narrative. We've been focused mainly on the Old Testament so far. These are the 39 books of the Old Testament. We went through the Law of Moses, the first 5 books. We worked our way through the historical books. And then the last session, we went through the prophetical books, the 16 prophets. All these prophetical books fit over here, mainly in 1st and 2nd Kings. These 2 books here contain most of the stories of these prophets as they're speaking to the kingdoms of Israel, the northern and southern kingdoms. But some fall in 1 Samuel. And the last 3 prophets of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they fit down here in the Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther area, along with Daniel and Ezekiel. Those 5 prophets all wrote after the return. After we talked about that last session, so feel free to watch that video. Just a quick timeline we shared last time. It's good to have some key dates in mind as you go through the Bible, and this is just something you can come back and look to. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just know it all started about 2000 BC with the call of Abraham. Became 1,000 years later to King David and the monarchy, then the divided kingdom about 931 BC. And the northern kingdom fell to Assyria at about 722 BC. Then we had Assyria fell to Babylon. And then the Babylonians came and took over the southern kingdom in 586 BC. And then we had Cyrus the Great come with the Persian Empire and the first returns from captivity led by Zerubbabel. And then, of course, Ezra and Nehemiah as the temple was rebuilt in about 516. So you can come back to this slide and pause if you want to look at these a little more deeper. But that's kind of where we've been over the last couple weeks or couple sessions, looking at how things fit this timeline. Now we're going to start transitioning to the New Testament, right? The New Testament, which is 27 books, dissecting about 5 different areas. We have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the story of the narration of Jesus' life teachings, his birth, teachings, and death, and resurrection. Then we have the book of Acts, which is the history of the early church as it grew, first in Judea, then outside of Judea. And then we have Paul's epistles. Paul wrote 13 letters, 9 to churches and 4 to people. And the thing about Paul's letters, as I've mentioned before, is when Paul wrote a letter, whatever the name of the letter was who it was to. So the Romans here was written to the church of Rome. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are written to the church of Corinth, and so on. And Paul's individual letters are to the person. So 1st and 2nd Timothy are written to Timothy, and then Titus and Philemon. The general epistles, these are epistles written by other people. The name of the letter is the author. So not who it's to, but who the author is. For instance, James is written by James, Peter, 1st, 2nd Peter written by Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John written by John, and then Jude written by Jude. Hebrews, we don't know who the author is. Most scholars think it's Paul, but it's kind of anonymous. So that's kind of the letters part, the epistles of the New Testament. Then of course, we have the book of Revelation at the end, the apocryphal book written by John. So these are the 27 books of the New Testament. We're going to start with the Gospels. After this week, after we go through the intertestamental period, we're going to jump into the Gospels and go through those next time. So the little history, where we've been. We started the sessions with the call of Abraham out of Ur. Abraham was called to Haran, came down to the Promised Land, about 1,000-mile journey. You had Isaac and Jacob. The Israelites ended up over here in Egypt. First, through Joseph, but then they were there 400 or 500 years, and Moses, through the Exodus, led them out of Egypt into the Sinai. Then eventually came around to the east bank of the Jordan River, led by Joshua, and went into the promised land, conquered it. We covered all this several sessions ago in the books of Joshua and the books of Judges. And then we had the monarchy um, of King Saul, and then King David, and then King Solomon. And then we had a divided monarchy. And so this is kind of the close-up of the promised land. You have, um, you have the coastal area, the Shephelah, or the kind of leading into the hills. You have this ridge of, I wouldn't call them mountains, but hills, and then it drops down to the Jordan Valley. Then we have the Transjordan Plateau up here. So this is the area that, all the Bible's talking about for the most part, until we get to the, book of Acts. And most of it takes place here. Same cities, same areas. And that's why if you get familiar with these areas, as you go through the Bible and see the different stories, you'll start to get really familiar with places. It really helps when you do that in the Old Testament, because then when you get to the New Testament, Jesus is teaching and things are going on in the New Testament. There's a lot of backdrop, a lot of history to these areas. This is a divided kingdom. We had the kingdom in the north that fell in 722 BC to the Assyrians, and the Judah, the kingdom in the south, fell to 586 BC. It fell to the Babylonians. We've covered that at length in past sessions. So we have these empires. Let's talk about these empires that come through. Real empires. You read about them in history. They're not some myth, fable. They actually happened. We had the Assyrian Empire sweep through, the first major empire of the world. Swept through the Levant, which is the area here between Assyria and Egypt. It's called the Levant, where Israel is located. Captured most of it. Didn't capture Jerusalem, though. They didn't get Jerusalem and part of Judah. They got some of it stayed independent through the Assyrians. And then came the Babylonian Empire. They did capture Judah and brought the captives all the way over here to Babylon, right? And we, like I said, discussed that in past sessions. And so now Judah, there's no more kingdom of Israel. It's gone. It's obliterated for 70 years. But then comes the Persian Empire, and Cyrus the Great, the first Persian king, let the Israelites return from Babylon. So they had 3 trips or so. We have first Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And so they're back in Judea, and in Jerusalem specifically, rebuilding the temple. That all happened under the Persian Empire. And just kind of give you a couple of historical references here of how historical figures are in the Bible that aren't part of the, necessarily part of Israel or the story of the Bible as far as the Israelites and salvation. But we have, for instance, these kings of Persia. We have, these are the kings of Persia, and just as a couple examples, Cyrus the Great, you can read about in Isaiah and Jeremiah, 2 prophets prophesied about Cyrus the Great, and he's the one that let Zerubbabel go back to Judah, followed by Ezra and Nehemiah. Darius the First is mentioned in the Bible as well. That's when Zechariah and Haggai, 2 of the 12 prophets, were prophesying under Darius. Xerxes is the husband of Esther in the book of Esther. That's the king that's referenced. And then Ezra and Nehemiah were sent back to Judah under Artaxerxes, first Ezra, then a while later Nehemiah. So these are real kings of Persia that are in the Bible as part of the story. God uses various people for his purposes. But this is just a little historical reference. And then as we look at the book of Daniel, several kings are mentioned because Daniel was taken into captivity in 597 BC or 605 BC, excuse me. And he was in Babylon for many, many years, or his whole life. But Babylon was under the Babylonian Empire, and then it was also under the Persian Empire in Daniel's life, Prophet Daniel. And so he was first taken under Nebuchadnezzar. Then you can read about Belshazzar. And then Darius the Mede is also mentioned in the book of Daniel. And Cyrus the Great is also mentioned in the book of Daniel. So these kings of these empires are mentioned in Daniel. So, and then we have Judea at the return. So the Jews got back to Judea under those 3 waves of people I've already mentioned. And this is what it looked like. You had all the activity going here in Judah, rebuilding the temple, and then later rebuilding of Jerusalem and the walls. And you had these other precincts around that were governed by other people, all under the Persian Empire. So these are all governors that are appointed by the Persian Empire. Matter of fact, Nehemiah was governor of Judea. And that was by King Artaxerxes. So so these are the same people's groups we've been talking about for a while. You got Moab, you got the Ammonites, Gilead up here on the east side of the Jordan, of course Galilee in the north on the west side of the Jordan, Samaria, Judea, and then Idumea. We'll talk more about Idumea in a bit. So, intertestamental period, 430 BC to 4 BC. These are kind of some of the things we're gonna highlight. We're gonna be talking about these empires, the Grecian, and now after the Persian Empire comes the Grecian Empire. Then we have the Hellenization. What does that mean? That's when the whole empire started speaking Greek, writing in Greek, and have a lot of Greek culture. Then we had the Diadochi Wars, which we'll talk about. After Alexander died, his generals took over and they fought over these lands. And then we had the rise of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and they had a major impact on Israel at that time, of Judea and Samaria and the surrounding regions. And then we have a couple of people groups come up, the Hasmonean dynasty and the Herodian dynasty. We're going to talk about. We're also going to talk about the rise of people groups. We have the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. These are people groups that didn't really exist when Malachi wrote the last book of the Old Testament, 430 BC. These are new groups that kind of emerged over this 400-year period, mainly in the last 200 years of that 400-year period. You have these people groups rise up, and that you're going to read about in the New Testament and in the book of Acts and in different parts of the in the Gospels. And so it's kind of good to have an idea, who are these people groups? Where did they come from? Because they have a major impact on the story, especially in the Gospels and in the early church. Okay, so here we have the Grecian Empire in about 334 BC, 333 BC. We have a guy named Alexander the Great. He was quite a young man. Alexander's father, King Philip, died, was assassinated up here in Macedonia, Philip of Macedon. And then Alex became, general and took over the army. And he conquered Greece first, then he worked his way east. And he went through present-day Turkey and conquered this land. As he's beating the Persians along the way, as he's beating back the Persian Empire, when he got to about here, he decided to go to the south and shore up his south flank, so that as he goes farther east, people, the Persian Empire can't kind of re-arise behind him and come and cut him off. So he had this campaign down the Phoenician coast in Israel, and very successful, and came here into Egypt and conquered this area of the Persian Empire. And then he founded this very important city called Alexandria, named after himself. And Alexandria became very, very well-known city, very large city in Christendom, actually, but also with the Jews. It was the second largest city in the Roman Empire. A lot of history in Alexandria, so we can talk about. But this is when it was founded under Alexander's conquest of Egypt in the early part of his empire, as he's taken over more and more lands. So once he shores up Egypt, comes back through the Levant or through Israel, and then continues east, conquering Babylon and all the way to India. It was a huge, largest empire of the day, all the way to India. And then he came back. And interestingly enough, back here in Babylon, after conquering all these lands, he ended up dying in 323 BC, about 32, 33 years old. So still very young, but he died. And then we enter this period of what's called a Diadochi, which means the Greek word for successor. So his successors fought over his empire, and you had these Diadochi Wars that came about. You have these different generals. We're not going to go into a lot of time here, but just know this is kind of what's going on in the world at this time at about 316 BC to about 301. You have these different kingdoms of these generals of his, Cassander and Seleucus and Ptolemy and others, fighting over his kingdom that he had just conquered over the 10 years preceding that. And it was, quite brutal. They're pretty bloody. They're all Greek, so they're all of Grecian heritage. So even but they're all fighting for power and control. And this is called the Diadochi Wars. The Seleucids, rule is up here. It's not on this map, but right up here where my dot is. They founded the city of Antioch, and that was their capital. And Antioch became a very, very important city in the Roman Empire. It was the third largest city of the empire eventually, but also became a very, very important city for Christendom. That's where Paul started his first 3 missionary journeys from. That's where Christians were first called Christians, as we learn in Acts chapter 11 and 12 in Antioch, and just a lot of church history there. But that it was actually founded in this period under the Seleucids. So during this time, we got the Septuagint, right? And what is the Septuagint? The Septuagint, some of you have heard me talk about this before. It's a very important turn of events in Judaism and in Christendom, in a sense, even though it's before Christ, about 250 years before Christ. We had so many Jews now living outside of Judea, more Jews outside than inside Judea, and a lot of them didn't speak Hebrew anymore because of this Greek-speaking Hellenization of the empire. Everyone speaking Greek. And so you had this large Jewish population that no longer spoke Hebrew. And so one of the Ptolemaic kings petitioned the high priest of Alexandria to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And that's exactly what he did. He brought in 70 to 72 scholars from Judea, and they worked on it, and they translated the Hebrew text to Greek. And so about 230 BC, we ended up with this Greek Old Testament. And this was actually what became prevalent around the empire for reading of Scripture, because more people spoke Greek than Hebrew, especially outside of Judea. And this is what Paul, even Jesus and others in the New Testament, when they refer to Old Testament Scripture, they're referring to the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew. We also had the rise of some people groups in this time at about 200 BC or so. We have the rise of some people groups, and the rise of the synagogue, right? The synagogue. The synagogue was first established when the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon in 586, and there was no more temple to worship in, so they started having these places of meeting. But it became prevalent as Jews moved throughout the empire. They would set up these synagogues, and the earliest one they found is in Alexandria, by under Ptolemy III, and it was a place of prayer. But there were some before that, probably in Babylon and so forth. But as far as actually archaeological finds, these are some of the earliest ones. They were established throughout the ancient world. A lot of times there was multiple synagogues in a single city, especially if there was a big Jewish population in that city. And it became a very, very important part of Christendom, which we'll get into when we go through the book of Acts. Because this is how the gospel is actually spread, was Paul and others going to synagogues throughout the known world, preaching Jesus from the Old Testament. Having synagogues there is really a big part of how Christianity originally spread outside of Judea. And then they had leadership groups that required at least 10 men to form a synagogue. And then they'd meet on the Sabbath and in the afternoon. So it was a place of meeting, a place of gathering, these synagogues. These came about during this 200 or so, this 400-year period between Malachi and the Bible. Then we had these people groups arise, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These are religious leaders, but with there were differences to them. The Pharisees standing for the separated ones. They held to authority of the entire Old Testament, as well as the oral law. They believed in miracles and angels and immortality. So they believed in the afterlife. They believed in the future of the resurrection. So people will be resurrected. And they're very popular in the synagogues. They're very popular teachers among the people. And then we had the Sadducees, the righteous ones. They viewed the Torah as having greater authority. So the first 5 books of the Bible. They did not believe in miracles, angels, or immortality. They denied life after death. And they ruled in the temples. They were more wealthy. They were more well-to-do on societal hierarchy, and they ruled the temple sacrifices and worship and so forth. And so those were the Sadducees, and they didn't always get along. We saw it in the New Testament, like for instance in Acts when Paul's brought to the Sanhedrin and so forth, and they're kind of fighting over things. And with Jesus, you read about in the Sanhedrin, you have the Pharisees and Sadducees discussing things. But these are who these 2 groups are, these 2 leadership groups. And you also had this 3rd group that kind of arose during this period, maybe the last couple hundred years before Christ, the Essenes. They were a splinter group of the Sadducees, but it could be the Pharisees. They're not really sure where exactly they came from, but they felt that both the Sadducees and Pharisees had been corrupted, and they were more the purified ones. So they kind of secluded themselves from society and just had a lot of purification rituals. A lot of them were celibate. They studied Scripture. And this is actually where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran in 1947, 48, 49. In all those 11 caves or so, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were kept by the Essenes. So it was an old Essene compound. And so very, very important discovery for archaeology in general, but especially for biblical archaeology, which we've kind of discussed in the past as well. So these are the Essenes, these guys that kind of separated themselves from society for purification purposes because they thought the Sadducees and Pharisees were corrupt. Right. So here we are. We have the Seleucids kind of running Judea, right? And then in about 167 BC, one of the Seleucid leaders, a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, lost a campaign in Egypt, was coming back through Judea, was very upset, and kind of took it out on the Jews. He was already kind of harsh. And during his reign, he desecrated the temple in Jerusalem by erecting a statue of Zeus and offering swine on the altar, stopping the daily sacrifice, and enforcing Greek culture and worship of the Jews. So basically, he enforced Greek culture over the worship of the Jews. So he kind of didn't allow them to practice Judaism. He desecrated the temple. It was a huge disgrace to the Jewish population. And that's what gave rise to the Maccabean revolt by the Hasmoneans. So once again, a little summary. 198, the Seleucids overtake this area. 167, the temple is desecrated. 2 years later, under the Hasmoneans, its temple is liberated. And then we have some more fighting. But when the temple is liberated, that's what's celebrated every year in Hanukkah. Hanukkah is celebrating the Jewish liberation of this desecration from this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. And so that's what Hanukkah is all about. So we have this family, right? We have this guy named Mattathias, who was a priest, and he revolted. He actually killed a Jew that was kind of siding with the Seleucids and practicing Hellenism. And then this uprising, him and his 5 sons started this uprising after this atrocity in the temple by Antiochus. So these are the 5 brothers. Not getting too much. It's a lot of history here, but just know that the name Maccabees comes from Judas. He was called Judas Maccabees. Maccabees means the hammer. Judas the hammer is a great warrior. And then the line continued under John Hyrcanus, Matthias' grandson, through Simon. And so you have this hierarchy of about 100 years of leadership of these Hasmoneans, and they won their independence from the Seleucids. So they're kind of Israel's once again under their own control through this family of priests, basically. Even though you have it's still continuing under the Hasmonean rule, they ruled as a client state of Rome. They're no longer independent, right? So you had Hyrcanus come in, Aristobulus for a little bit, then Hyrcanus took over, then his son, then they were done in 37 BC. But this area here is all under Roman authority, and that's what brought Rome. This is what, and I'll talk about that in a sec, but this is kind of what it looked like under the Hasmonean rule. You have these different Hasmonean leaders expanding, and so Israel is now growing under Hasmonean rule and conquering areas and bringing areas under its authority for this 100-year period or so. And so this is an in-between period between the Seleucid rule and then the Roman rule, okay? And so you have, but during this time, you have the rise of the Roman Empire. So you have this empire from the west that's rising. And so we have to Palestine. And so now Palestine, when I say Palestine, I'm talking about the greater area of Samaria and Judea and Idumea and Galilee. They're under the Romans. The Romans are a client state of Rome, and that's only going to expand. So here comes the Roman Empire, all right? Here comes the Roman Empire. So, and as it grew, it got quite large. It became one of the most powerful empires in the world's ever seen, actually, for its time. And so now we have Judea, a client state of Rome. One thing about the Roman Empire that's very important to the spread of Christendom, we mentioned earlier that the Grecian Empire brought in Hellenization, where everybody kind of got Hellenized, meaning they converted to Greek culture, Greek language, Greek writing. So that's going to help spread to Christianity. And the reason I say that is when you think about it, when we get to Paul the Apostle, or in the early church, disciples that are spreading the word, when they go outside of Judea, you can't take a Hebrew Bible and go all the way over here to Pergamon or Macedonia or even Rome and preach out of this Hebrew Bible. No one would understand what you're saying. It wouldn't make any sense. But because everybody spoke Greek, and we now have this Greek Bible that was written down here in Alexandria 250 years earlier, that's what they took with them. They took this Greek Bible to Greek-speaking people, and they're able to actually present the gospel from the Old Testament in a language that everybody can understand. So because of this Hellenization, that allowed the gospel to be spread language-wise. And what the Romans did, they were very good at building infrastructure, aqueducts, bridges, dams, and roads. They built over 250,000 miles of roads throughout their empire. So now it was much, much easier to travel from place to place in all these road systems, where 100 years earlier, 200 years earlier, it would be very difficult to go out and spread, for instance, the gospel or any message. It's hard to get around. It's hard to get places, but now it's much easier. And as we're going to study in the book of Acts in a couple sessions, when Paul and the early apostles went out, they're traveling on roads up to Antioch, over to Ephesus, and over to then sail over to Philippi, Macedonia, and down to Athens and Corinth, and all the places they went. It was all by these road systems that the Romans had put in place. So very, very important. This is kind of a map of the the diaspora. The dispersion is what diaspora stands for, the dispersion. These are like some places that the Jews were living. As I mentioned, there's more Jews outside of Judea than inside. And a huge group in Alexandria we've talked about. Up here in Antioch, there's some Jews. Babylon had a large group that stayed after the captivity, even as far as Susa. And then throughout the Roman Empire, you had all these Jews that were spreading out through business, through other things. And you had synagogues, and you had, Judaism, people worshiping Yahweh in all these places. Once again, that becomes a huge factor when the gospel spread, because what Paul did, he started in Antioch. He took a Greek Bible that everyone could read on a Roman road, because it's easy to travel, and then went throughout the empire preaching at all these synagogues that were already there because of this diaspora. So this is just God orchestrating the timing of the gospel, of when it could actually spread and reach the people it needed to reach. You can see it clearly when you just kind of step back and look at the bigger picture of history. So we have the Hasmonean dynasty coming to an end, and then you have Herod, the Herodian dynasty, this next group of leaders. So what happened was, you had Herod is in the land from 37 BC to 4 BC, ruling as the king of the Jews, as a client state of Rome. So this Roman has all the authority, but he is their puppet king, and he has the title of king of the Jews. He's Jewish by culture because he's an Edomian, and Edomians were all converted under the Hasmonean dynasty by force. So he's Jewish, but he's not Jewish blood. And the people know that, and that's why he's not real popular. And he's also crazy. He's also very brutal. He killed a lot of people, including his wife and sons. He killed all the children in early part of the Gospels, where in Bethlehem, and he's trying to kill Jesus. And we'll get to that story, when we get to the Gospels. But he was not a sane person or a kind person, but he was a great builder and a great warrior. And he had a lot of building projects, which we're going to look at. But this is kind of the Herodian dynasty. It started with his father Antipater, then it came to Herod the Great. And I'm not going to go through all this. You can come back and look at it on your own if you'd like to study it more. But just a couple of names to highlight that you're going to see in the New Testament. You have Herod Antipas, which is his son that ruled Galilee and Perea. He's the one that killed John the Baptist. You have Herod Agrippa, Herod the Great's grandson. You see him in Acts, killing James and putting Peter in prison. And then you have his son, Herod Agrippa II. You see him in Acts, later part of Acts, when Paul's under house arrest in Caesarea Philippi, and then he's with Festus, Governor Festus, and King Agrippa and Bernice come, and Paul preaches to them. That's Agrippa II. So you're going to see these names pop up in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. So it's good to be a little familiar with who they are, because they're ruling the areas that Jesus is ministering in, and that later Paul and the early apostles are preaching in. But that's under this Herodian dynasty. And this is what Herod's kingdom looked like when Herod ruled, when Jesus was born. And when Herod died, his sons took over, and you had Archelaus got Judah, and then Antipas got Galilee and Perea, and then Philip got Gilead and up here in the northeast, and then his sister Salome got this little area down here. And then when she died, it came under Roman rule. And so this is kind of these are some of the names as you read through the Gospels. These are some of the leaders that were in charge politically under the Roman, overall arching rulership. The last comment on this is his son Archelaus didn't last long, and when he was displaced, a Roman procurator came in. So this area here in Judea and Samaria were ruled by a Roman procurator. And I think the fourth one of those, or fourth or fifth, was Pontius Pilate. And then we read about Festus and Felix and Acts. So you have these Roman procurators ruling this area, while these outer areas were ruled by the descendants of Herod the Great. And then when they all passed away, it all came under Rome. So that's kind of how that looks politically. Herod was a great builder, and so these are some of his projects because you're going to read about them in the Gospels and in Acts. You're going to see them. And one of the biggest projects he did was the temple. He actually rebuilt the Jewish temple. And the Jewish temple was such a anchor and a foundational practice of Judaism. It was very, very important to Jews throughout history. And so this is actually a good thing for the Jews, as far as they probably really appreciated all the money and effort he put into rebuilding this magnificent temple. It even scaled up to Solomon's size. Maybe not as ornate as Solomon's, but it was quite a large project, and just a beautiful, beautiful temple. A little bit of the temple. So let's look at the history of the temple a little bit, how it evolved up until this point. This was the last temple, and that temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, never to be rebuilt even to this day. But how did we get here? Well, this was Solomon's original temple. We had the city of David down here, this lower area, and then up on the hill, you have the Temple Mount, and you have this beautiful gold-plated, beautiful wood, and this huge temple that Solomon built. You can read about in Kings and Chronicles. And then that was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. And then when Cyrus the Great released the Jews to come back and rebuild, they came back and they built Zerubbabel's temple, much less grandiose than Solomon's, very, kind of basic, but they were back in the land, in the temple. And you had the Holy of Holies in the Holy Place and the Holy of Holies and the Temple Mount. So you have a functioning temple under Zerubbabel. And then when the Seleucids came down and ruled, they added to the temple and they built the Akara, this little fortress next to it. And then we had the Hasmonean expansion. So when the Hasmonean came in, they expanded the temple and added to it some gates and walls and so forth, made it bigger and nicer. And then Solomon came along and he really just blew it up and made it this grandiose temple. And then we did have this Antonia fortress over here, which you can read about in Acts, for Paul's taken in prison. It's basically a Roman fortress they built overlooking the temple. The Jews hated it. It's kind of like Rome saying, we have authority, we're going to put our fortress right on top of your temple. So if you read about the Antonia fortress, the Gospels are in Acts, this is what it's referring to. But anyhow, this temple is huge. And this was the temple of Jesus' day. So when Jesus is preaching in the temple, this temple. It was Solomon's temple. Herod also built a huge palace, grandiose. He built Caesarea Maritima, this a huge port. These are the ruins today. You can go visit. It's quite impressive. But it was just a huge port city. They dredged this huge harbor. They didn't have many natural harbors in Israel. Joppa was one of the only ones. But now they had this huge harbor port with a palace, or small palace. This was the Romans moved their headquarters to. They had just a lot of Colosseum and different things. So it was quite impressive. He also built this fortress, Machaerus. So this is Jerusalem here. There's where my dot is. That's the Dome of the Rocks. This is the Temple Mount. And if you look all the way to the east, across the Dead Sea, up on this hill, this is where Machaerus is located. This is where John was beheaded in the Gospels. It's where King Antipas, in one of his fortresses that he stayed in, was one of Herod's fortresses originally. And so Herod built this fortress on top of this hill on the east side of the Dead Sea. And then we also had Masada, the famous fortress in the south. You have this huge flat mountaintop overlooking the Dead Sea and the Negev. And this was one of Herod's big building projects. And so here you have Israel. It's under Roman control. They've appointed Herod to lead it and his descendants. You have these Jewish groups that don't always get along: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes. You also have the Zealots, which are kind of they're revolting against the Roman Empire. One of Jesus's disciples was Simon the Zealot. It's a group that was kind of a militant group that was, actively trying to fight the Roman Empire. And then Jesus is born, and God waited for. I love this verse out of Galatians 4:4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son. And that was the fullness of time. We had everything that we've studied so far, from the Genesis, the beginning, all the way through the monarchy, the divided monarchy, the captivity period, the return period, this 400 years of intertestament period. It all led to this. It all led to Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the Messiah of Israel, as prophesied, born in Bethlehem of a virgin. This is the Judea he was born into. And so as we go through the Gospels in the next session, we'll start looking at some of the places a little more closely where he ministered, who he talked to. But this kind of gives you more of just an overview of the mindset of the local people at the time. There's a lot of division, a lot of resentment against the Romans, a lot of infighting with the religious groups. It's not one big cohesive group. They're all speaking Greek for the most part, Aramaic, still the language of the land, but just a lot of cultural differences. And this is like I said, this is where Jesus was born and started his ministry. And then we have, this is what Judea looked like at the time of Jesus. He was born here in Bethlehem, and he was raised up here in Galilee, in Nazareth, right? And you have the different. This is what we've been talking about over the last half hour or so. So yeah, so I hope this is helpful as we get ready to jump into the Gospels next session. And hope you enjoyed it, and have a great day.